Those sneaky, pesky New Testament writers, what a bunch of liars they are. How did you come to that conclusion? You can think that, and you almost have to think it logically. Either Jesus said it or Mark made it up. What's your opinion? How did you come by it? That's the key. Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. I've got a line here that I want to use at the beginning. It's going to be this. So, how did you come to that conclusion? It's a good question. It's a good question for people to ask me. It's a good question for me to ask you. We've been talking about the New Testament as history, it being trustworthy history, by the way. And the number one reason they don't think it is because the New Testament they think was anonymous. In other words, the Gospels, especially in Acts, were anonymous. I'd make the case, and we'll make it again, not today. No, it wasn't anonymous. How did you come to that conclusion? Did you know, and I'll just add this to it, did you know that there is not a single manuscript of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? We have some that are not, they don't have the names there because they've lost the title page or the end page, which would happen, of course. But there's not a single manuscript of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or Acts that does not have the name that we know and love. There's nobody thought, no, let's put a different name on this. Nobody thought that. Did they go around and steal all those manuscripts? I don't think so. I definitely don't believe so. The other problem that people have is that, and this is where we're headed today, well, the New Testament was written too long after the events that it portrays. I mean, 45 or 50 years later is just too long, and probably the apostles were dead anyway. And so the New Testament probably wasn't written by an apostle or given the testimony of an apostle, in Luke's case, because it was too long after that. This is 40, this would be Bart Ehrman again. There have been 40 or 50 years of the telephone game. And it's oral history. And here's the big punch here. We'll do more on this later, but we all know what happens with oral history. It's like the telephone game. Somebody tells a story, and then they tell the story, and gradually it changes over time. That's exactly not what happened with the New Testament documents, by the way. What if the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Acts, also written by Luke, and Paul's letters, and Peter's letters, and the Epistle of James, which was, most would agree, the first New Testament document. What if they were much earlier than you suppose, and that we suppose? Say, instead of being from the 70s to the late 90s, at least with the synoptics, even if you gave the Gospel of John and Revelation later in the 90s, what if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Acts were written between the 40s and the 60s? What if the apostles were very much still alive when these were written? And so were most of the other eyewitnesses in the life of Jesus. Paul refers to 500 eyewitnesses, and most of them were still alive. What about all the people that Jesus healed? And those were multitudes. What about all the multitude of people that listened to Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount? What about all the people who witnessed his crucifixion? What about all the people who came to know Jesus in Jerusalem, and 3,000 of them on the day of Pentecost, 50 days later? Were they all dead in the 50s? Obviously not. From a prior episode, we know this too. Now, I'm pushing the date earlier. That's the whole point of this episode here. We also know from a prior episode that the gospel message, the heart of Christianity, the heart of Christianity did not originate in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. It didn't even originate in the 50s. It didn't even originate in the 40s. We know, for example, that Paul taught the Gospel Creed in Corinth in 50 AD. But we know also that he got that creed 17 years earlier in Jerusalem, 3 years after he became a believer because he saw the risen Christ. And we know also then that that creed, or the gospel message creed, was composed earlier than that. Now we're talking about within 3 to 6 months after the crucifixion. They composed a creed, like a poem, so that illiterate people could share the gospel. So this whole idea of this is so long after the events and nobody knows what happened and nobody knows what the authors are, that's bogus. I mean, I hate to say that, be that strong about it, but at least it's bogus to me. Let's put it that way. So why after 70? Why do so many, and this is the consensus, I agree. The consensus of scholarship is that the New Testament wasn't written until after 70 AD. Why? How did you come to that conclusion? That's my point here. Well, let me tell you why. In Mark chapter 13 and in Matthew chapter 24 and in Luke chapter 21, Jesus made a prediction that Jerusalem was coming down. Not one stone of the temple would be standing, Jesus said to his disciples. Well, what we know is, and I've used this before, 70 AD is kind of the seminal date here for a lot of things. What we know historically is, you don't need the Bible for this, of course. You can look up this on Wikipedia or Google it. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans after a revolt by the Jewish population against Rome. It started in 66 AD, and finally Jerusalem was besieged. It was an awful time. Josephus records it. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were crucified. Many of them were killed and starved. And literally, the temple did come down stone by stone from the Romans. 70 AD. Now, here's the problem. If Jesus prophesied that in 30 or so, and then it was written in 40 or so, obviously all this is before the destruction of the temple. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is if the Christians would love to say, I told you so. So if they were writing after the fall of Jerusalem, why wouldn't they have said, Jesus said this was going to happen, and sure enough it did. They didn't say that, of course. So there are only a couple of options. Number one, Jesus didn't say it. In that case, if he did say it, he couldn't have said it after 33 AD because he's dead and risen, I think, and in heaven. Nonetheless, he's not on earth here. He couldn't have said it after 70 AD. Maybe Mark made it up. Those sneaky, pesky New Testament writers, what a bunch of liars they are. You can think that, and you almost have to think it logically. Either Jesus said it or Mark made it up. And even if Mark made it up, they would have to have been after 70 because Mark would have known then. It would have been a done deal, so to speak. Nah, it just does. No, not for me, not for me. Josephus, a couple of things here about this. Josephus said that there actually was somebody else after Jesus about 62 AD, so it would have been 8 years before it happened. There was a guy who did predict the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. He's called the son of Ananias, and he was severely beaten. He was arrested and severely beaten for predicting the fall of Jerusalem, and because Jerusalem was doing so well at the time, so says Josephus. Maybe he got the idea from Jesus. That's a real possibility. But there's something even better than that. That's after Jesus. What about way before Jesus? And I mean way before Jesus. Did you know that the prophet Daniel, in chapter 8, verses 13 and 14, say it's something called the abomination of desolation and the desecration of the temple and so forth. But Daniel predicts the destruction of the holy city 500 years earlier. He's teaching from Babylon when he does it. I think that's why they connected Rome, the persecutor of Christians, with Babylon, the destructor of Jerusalem at the time. And here's the neat thing. Jesus also used, and we're talking about Daniel predicting the fall of Jerusalem in the future, and also at that point in time, Jerusalem was destroyed, by the way, in 586 AD by the Babylonians, as was the Solomon's temple, the first temple. But Jesus used that. There was also a prophecy against the temple and the destruction of the temple by Isaiah. I've done a series on these recently, so it's in my mind here. All the Old Testament parables preceded judgment of some kind. So it is with Jesus and the parables in the New Testament too. But I want you to turn, if you will, to Mark chapter 12. This is the last week of Jesus' life, chapter 12, verse 1. So we're talking about the whole 70s idea. And listen, I'm telling you, I researched this. I actually found it even with Bart Ehrman again. He's kind of the go-to guy because he's the best at what he does. And they all say the reason that we think the New Testament must have been written after 70 AD is because Jesus couldn't have prophesied. It can't happen. He can't predict perfectly the destruction of Jerusalem 40 years earlier. Well, why not? Here's what he did say in his last week before he was crucified, along with the prediction of Jerusalem. Jesus then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard, but they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And it goes on to say, finally he sends his son and they kill him. The leaders of the day, the establishment, if you will, knew that he was preaching against them, because that's exactly the same exact lesson that Isaiah had preached to them 500 years earlier before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So my point here is this. I just take the New Testament for what it is, for what it's supposed to be. And here's my early dating for the New Testament. And again, how did you come to the conclusion that the New Testament was written really late, so the apostles were dead, and so there's no eyewitness testimony, and on and on and on you go? Well, the only really reason that you can come to that conclusion is that 70 AD is the cutoff date. It has to be after 70 AD because Jerusalem, it was a done deal by then. Really, that's it. And pretty much it is it. They have some other reasons that's written in Greek instead of Hebrew and so forth, but they don't amount to much, honestly. You might disagree with that. Let me give you my dating, and it's not just mine, by the way. At the end of Acts, Paul is still alive. He's still in Roman prison, still teaching while he's in prison because people come to visit him. And his own soldiers like to listen to him after some point, their guards. Peter was still alive at the end of Acts. No, Acts doesn't mention Paul's death. It doesn't mention Peter or James. And by the way, we know Josephus talks about the death of James, Jesus' brother, in 63 AD. So these are all part of Nero's persecution. Not in Acts. It hasn't happened yet, unless they just neglected it for some sneaky reason. We want to make it early. I don't think so. So if Acts was written before 65, let's say, we don't know exactly when those martyrdoms took place, somewhere around the time of Nero, so 63, 64, 65, make it a late date, then Luke was written before that. So now you've got back into the 50s or early 60s for Luke, but Matthew was written before Luke, most agree. So now we're down to the 50s, and Mark was written first, and James before that. We're not talking about a long time after Jesus died. We're not talking certainly about the time the apostles died. The New Testament is just what it appears to be. It appears to be apostolic, which is the whole point of it. That's why the book of Acts is called the Acts of the Apostles, because that's where the authority comes from. And we're going to do a video on this, but it's Jesus gives the authority. Obviously, God gives the authority to Jesus, who is God, I'm convinced. Maybe you're not. But God gives the authority to Jesus. Jesus gives the authority to the apostles. The apostles give the authority to the Word of God, to the New Testament. And that's what we use as our reference point. What's your opinion and how did you come by it? That's the key. Thanks for watching.